a werewolf shifter romance written by Rosie. Caleb's loneliness was not an empty space, but an actively defended territory. Every roar of the wind against Ashbourne Fortress's window panes was an invader repelled. Every sound of his own footsteps in the stone corridors was a reminder that he was the sole inhabitant of his crumbling kingdom. His scars no longer hurt, at least not the physical ones, which carved his torso and arms like a map of lost battles. The pain that remained was a heavy ghost, an echo of the screams of the men he had commanded, the friends he had buried, the weight of a crown he had cast into the fire long ago. He was once an alpha king. Now he was just a man, or what was left of one. Isolation in the Black Forest was his only anchor, until the anchor broke. Chapter 1. Her arrival was announced not by trumpets, but by the irritating creak of a wagon's wheels in the stone courtyard. Caleb watched from his high window, his amber eyes, once compared to gold, now dull as aged honey, observing the scene below. A figure hopped from the wagon, wrapped in simple rags and a worn cloak, wild wheat blonde hair, disheveled and wet from the rain that was beginning to fall. Nothing of the pale nobility he was accustomed to. She was a gust of fresh air in a crypt, and he instinctively wanted to close the window. The butler, Dominic, a man so old and dry he seemed made of the fortress's own dust, presented her hours later in the great hall. "Master Caleb," Dominic whispered, his voice a rustle of dry leaves. He values his privacy. You will tend to the herb gardens and medicinal needs. Do not wander. Do not ask questions. The girl, Emma, did not seem intimidated. Her eyes, a disarmingly clear blue, swept across the gloomy hall, the tattered banners, the empty fireplace. "I did not come to cause trouble, Master Dominic," she replied, her voice soft but firm, carrying the lilting accent of the lowlands. "The herbs do not care for their master's mood. They only need care." Caleb chuckled, a low, bitter sound that did not escape his throat. Care. It was all he could not allow. Care implied proximity. Proximity meant danger. He avoided her for days, a conscious ghost in his own home, but she was impossible to ignore. She brought life with her. The scent of wet earth and wild basil followed her through the corridors. She hummed to the plants in the herb garden, a simple, rural melody that cut through the stone walls and found his ears, importunate and persistently. It was this humming that finally led her to him. He was in his study, a throbbing migraine behind his eyes, the beast within him restless with the approaching full moon, when the sound of her voice reached the forbidden West Wing corridor. That corridor led to his family's old quarters. To his old quarters. Rage was an instant relief. He flung the door open so hard it slammed against the stone wall. She turned, not a jot of surprise, as if she had been expecting him. Up close, he could see her face was freckled, and the tips of her fingers, holding a wicker basket full of leaves, were stained with earth. "What are you doing here?" His voice came out as a growl, rough from disuse. She did not recoil. "There's dampness in this wall," she said, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "It's rotting the wood and causing mildew, bad for the structure, even worse for the lungs. And it's spoiling the valerians stored here. The root is weakening." He took a step forward, invading her space. Her scent was unlike anything else in the fortress, wild lemon and simple soap, without the heady perfume of nobility or the smell of fear most people exuded near him. He saw her eyes examine his exposed scars at the neckline of his tunic, but there was no fear in that gaze. There was a clinical assessment, like a healer examining a wound. "Your opinion on masonry doesn't interest me," he lied, feeling the beast writhing inside him, annoyed by her calmness. This corridor is forbidden. You don't belong here." "Mildew doesn't obey your rules, sir," she replied, her stubbornness beginning to gleam through her composure. "It grows where life allows it." Her audacity was like a shock of ice water. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, trying to finally instill the awe his rank once demanded. "Listen carefully, girl. You are a servant here. Perform your duties and stay out of my way." The words, his private mantra of isolation, hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. He waited to see her run, waited to see her cower. Instead, the corners of Emma's mouth curved upwards in a small, trembling, but genuine smile. Her blue eyes sparkled with a flash of pure, insolent amusement. "You'd miss me if I did that," she whispered, her voice as soft as silk, yet cutting as a blade. And then, before he could process that frontal assault on his reality, she turned. Her simple skirts swirled gently, and she continued down the corridor, her humming resuming, a little louder and more defiant this time. Caleb stood, motionless as the statues in the alcoves. The fury was still there, a fire in his veins, but he couldn't reach it. It had been overshadowed by something entirely new, a vacuum of perplexity. "You'd miss me if I did that." The fortress, once deafening in its silence, suddenly seemed to scream the echo of that phrase, and deep within his ravaged being, a horrible, tiny truth began to sprout, fragile as the first green shoot on a devastated battlefield. She was right. Chapter 2. The kitchen was the only truly warm place in Ashbourne, a vast stone den where the aroma of rye bread and bone broths perpetually competed with the smell of smoke and mold. And at the center of it all was Brom, the cook. He was a man as wide as a barrel, with a grizzled beard that seemed to harbor crumbs from every meal of the last decade. His eyes, small and bright as raisins, filled with genuine tears of joy when Emma appeared with a handful of her freshly picked mint. "By the ancient gods, a living soul!" he exclaimed, his voice a friendly rumble that made the cauldrons clink. "The last green thing that came in here was the mold on Dominic's cheese. Come in, girl, come in." It was in the kitchen that she met Brioche, a little girl no older than 6, with disheveled hair the color of raw bread dough and 2 huge brown eyes that missed nothing. "I am Brioche," she announced, lifting her head with ridiculous solemnity, "like the bread." "I gave her a piece of brioche one day, and she declared it her new name. She refused to be called anything else ever since," Brom explained, wiping his hands on his apron. "My granddaughter. The fortress is all she knows." There was a deep sadness in his voice that contrasted with the warm atmosphere of the kitchen. Brioche quickly became Emma's shadow, following her on her rounds in the gardens, her incessant chatter filling the gloomy silences. It was through the child's eyes that Emma began to see the outlines of the truth. "Lord Caleb makes noises at night," Brioche commented one day, while helping, or hindering, Emma plant lavender seeds. "Like a wolf with a tummy ache." "Brioche!" Brom's voice came from the kitchen doorway, laden with a rare warning. Emma looked at the child, then at Brom's worried face. "Wolf noises?" she asked softly. Brum sighed, his large body sinking onto a nearby bench. "It's best you don't meddle, girl. The master, he came back from the war different. The things he saw, the things he did, left marks no healer can stitch. Sometimes the pain, it escapes." Emma asked no more. She saw the marks for herself. Days later, she was in the forest, on the edge of Ashbourne's property, gathering willow bark, when she heard a dry snap, followed by a muffled groan of agony. Following the sound, she found Caleb kneeling by a stream, holding his left arm at an odd angle. His breath was ragged, and his eyes were wild, golden like those of a cornered animal. The branch of a fallen tree, thick as a man's thigh, lay broken in half beside him. He saw her before she could hide, his face twisted in anger and shame. "What are you doing here?" he growled, trying to stand and failing, his face contorting in pain. "Gathering willow bark?" she replied, keeping her voice calm, though her heart pounded in her chest. She approached, her eyes analyzing his arm. "For pain. Looks like you need some." "Get out of here," he spat, but the strength had left his voice, replaced by a palpable nausea. Emma ignored him. She knelt beside him, ignoring the intense heat radiating from his body. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath. A bird called once, then fell silent. Emma's hands moved with practiced precision, first assessing the damage with light touches that made Caleb's jaw clench. The dislocation was clean, at least. No fractures she could detect through the swollen tissue. "I've done this twice before," she said, more to herself than to him, her voice steady, despite the way her pulse hammered. "Once for my father when he fell from a ladder, once for a farmhand who thought he could wrestle a stubborn ox." She glanced at his face, saw the sheen of sweat on his brow. "You're larger than both of them, but the principle is the same." He watched her through half-lidded eyes, his breathing shallow. There was something almost meditative in her focus, the way her fingers traced the line of displaced bone with a healer's certainty. She wasn't seeing the monster he feared himself to be. She was seeing an injury, a problem with a solution. "I can help," she said simply. "I need you to stay very still, no matter what your instincts tell you to." She met his gaze directly. "Can you do that?" He wanted to laugh at the absurdity. A slip of a girl asking if he, a former alpha king, could control himself. But the sincerity in her eyes stopped him. She wasn't questioning his strength. She was asking for his trust. He laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You, a country girl, will fix the arm of a stubborn man?" she finished, reaching for her herb bag. Her hands didn't tremble. She had done this before. A man, even as big as Caleb, wasn't so different. He watched her, suspicious, as she pulled out a leather strip and a piece of orris root. "Bite this. It will hurt." Caleb hesitated, his warrior pride at war with the excruciating pain. Finally, the pain won. He took the root with a growl and clamped it between his teeth. Emma made no ceremony. She laid her hands on him. The contact was like a shock to both of them. For Caleb, it was the first time anyone had touched him without fear or violence. Her hands were firm, cool, and competent. For Emma, it was feeling the steel tension beneath his skin, the latent power dwelling within him, an undercurrent of raw strength. It was frightening. It was fascinating. "Ready?" she asked. He closed his eyes and nodded. There was a quick pull, a wet guttural snap, and a muffled grunt from Caleb. The sharp pain became a throbbing one, but the arm was back in place. He spat out the root, gasping, sweat trickling down his temples. He looked at his arm, then at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and reluctant respect. "Now, stay still." She began to fashion a sling from a clean cloth she took from her bag. He watched her in silence, his breathing slowly normalizing. The fury had dissipated, leaving behind a weariness so deep it felt bony. "You shouldn't have seen that," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "Seen what?" she asked, not looking up from her knot. "A hurt man? That's nothing new. Men are always getting hurt." He did not reply. When she finished, he stood up, testing his arm cautiously. The pain was a dull ache. He faced her, and for the first time, there was no wall of anger between them. There was only a shared weariness and an unanswered question. "The willow," he began, his voice strangely soft. "I'll make you a tea tonight. Leave it in the kitchen." She turned to leave, Brioche's lesson about wolf noises echoing in her mind. She paused and looked back at him over her shoulder. And try not to break any more trees in half with your body. Willow bark is scarce. She left him alone by the stream, the ghost of her touch still fresh on his skin, and the bitter taste of Orris and his own humility still on his tongue. The fortress no longer seemed so silent. Now it held the sound of her voice and the disturbing echo of his own vulnerability. Chapter 3. The pain in Caleb's shoulder was a dull, constant reminder, but it was no longer the only thing occupying his thoughts. The willow bark tea he found every night atop an old chest at the entrance to his quarters was bitter as gall, yet he drank it to the last drop. He never saw her leave it, but he knew it was her. It was a silent ritual, an invisible thread connecting their days. And then one day, the tea wasn't there. It was a particularly grim day, and the absence of that small act of care, because he could no longer pretend it was anything else, seemed to amplify the fortress's silence. He roamed the corridors, his presence making the few servants scurry away even faster. He wasn't looking for her, of course not. He was just inspecting his property. He finally found her in the inner courtyard, a place he hadn't visited in years. The scene made him pause in the shadows of an arcade. Emma was kneeling on the earth, not in the formal herb garden, but in an abandoned corner where only weeds grew. Brioche was beside her, her small fingers soiled with dirt, mimicking Emma's every movement. "And this is Catnip." Emma's voice was soft and clear, cutting through the fog of his own headache. "It likes slightly shady spots, and if you rub the leaves like this," she guided the child's hand to a fuzzy leaf, "you smell it. It's good for the tummy when it's sick." Brioche sniffed her fingers and her eyes widened. "It smells like the forest." Emma laughed, a sound Caleb hadn't heard since before the war. It was a simple, unpretentious melody that made something clench in his chest. That's when he realized the absence of the tea wasn't an oversight. She was busy. She had a life that didn't revolve around his pain. The revelation was absurdly unsettling. He must have made a noise, because Emma's blue eyes lifted and met his in the shadows. Her smile vanished, replaced by a neutral caution. Brioche, however, had no such inhibitions. "Lord Caleb," the little girl cried, running towards him with dirt-stained hands. "Lady Emma is teaching me how to make the garden smell nice. She said catnip can help your pain and the wolf noises." Caleb froze. His gaze flew from Brioche to Emma, who was now standing, wiping her hands on her skirt, her face impassive, but her eyes were studying him, connecting the dots. Pain, wolf noises. Emma gently pulled Brioche back. "Go wash your hands, Brioche. Your grandfather's bread must be almost ready." The child scampered off, and the silence that settled was heavy and charged. "She's imaginative," he said, the phrase sounding foolish and defensive in his own ears. "She's a child," Emma replied, her gaze still fixed on him. "Your tea, I'm sorry. I got busy with Brioche today. I'll make it soon." He nodded, a short, abrupt nod. He wanted to say something, anything, to dispel that keen gaze, to erase the connection she was clearly making between his pain, his fury, and the nocturnal noises. "The garden, it's good," he forced the words out, feeling like an idiot. He hadn't looked at the garden in years. She was surprised by the compliment. A faint blush rose to her cheeks. "Thank you. The soil here is good. It just needed a little attention." Like me, a treacherous, pathetic thought surfaced in his mind, and he violently suppressed it. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Caleb," She used his name. Without the Lord. It was the first time. He turned slowly. She held out a small sprig of catnip. For you. Crush the leaves and smell them when the headache starts. It helps calm the nerves. He stood still, looking at the small green sprig she extended. It was such a small, simple gesture, yet laden with understanding no one else had shown him. She wasn't afraid. She was caring for him. Hesitantly, he reached out and took the sprig. His fingers brushed hers for a fraction of a second, but the warmth of the contact seemed to course through his entire arm. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rougher than intended. He walked away, the fresh scent of catnip filling his senses, mingling with her perfume that seemed to still linger in the air. The fortress no longer felt like a silent battlefield. Now, it felt like a puzzle, and Emma was slowly finding all the pieces, one by one, unhurriedly, fearlessly. And he, the great broken alpha, stood in the middle of it all, holding a small sprig of mint as if it were the only anchor in a turbulent sea. Chapter 4. The piece of the garden was a recent and fragile conquest. Emma worked alone at the edge of the forest, digging valerian roots where the shadow of the trees was densest. The air was quiet, heavy. The only sound was the scrape of her spade on the damp earth and the distant song of a bird. It was this quietness that made the neck sound so viscerally wrong. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very bowels of the forest. Emma froze, her fingers still curled around a root. She turned slowly. 2 yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness between the trunks. Then, the wolf emerged. It was not a creature of fairy tales, but a lean, starved, dangerously real animal, its gray fur bristling, its teeth bared in a snarl. Hunger was a visible beast in its prominent ribs. It was within Ashbourne's territory, desperate enough to challenge human proximity. Emma's heart pounded, beating against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slowly rose, holding the spade like a fragile weapon. Her mind raced. Screen? The fortress was too far. Run. It would be an invitation to be taken down. She took a step back, then another, her eyes locked on the animals. The wolf advanced, a determined step, its growl increasing in volume. It was then that the air shifted. It was not a sound, but a pressure, a sudden change in the atmosphere that made the hairs on Emma's arms stand on end. It was like the loaded, deadly calm that precedes a lightning strike. The wolf felt it first. Its ears flattened against its skull, and its growl disappeared, replaced by a whine of confusion and primal fear. It retreated, bumping into a bush. And then Caleb was there. He did not emerge from the shadows. He was the shadow that solidified between her and the danger. He had not run. He seemed to have materialized from the very anger of the forest. He stood between her and the wolf, his broad back blocking her view of the beast. Emma could barely breathe. He said not a word. He didn't need to. His posture was enough, a line of pure predatory tension. But it was the sound that came from him that made Emma's blood run cold in her veins. A low growl so deep she felt it in her chest, not just heard it. It was not human. It was the sound of cracking earth, of absolute authority. It was an archaic warning that spoke directly to the animal's core. The wolf whimpered, a vocalization of pure terror. It turned and fled, disappearing into the forest with its tail between its legs, defeated without a single blow being struck. The pressure in the air dissipated as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind an abysmal silence. Caleb remained with his back to her, his shoulders rising and falling with a breath that was not entirely steady. Emma could see the muscles of his back tense beneath his simple tunic. The spade fell from her hand and landed with a dull thud on the earth. He slowly turned, his eyes, by the gods, his eyes. They still glowed with a remnant of that supernatural fury, a flash of liquid amber that seemed to catch the scant forest light. There was a wildness in them she had never seen, a raw ferocity that should have terrified her. But all she felt was overwhelming relief and a question echoing in her mind. He stared at her, and she saw the moment the beast retreated and the man returned. The realization of what he had revealed entered his eyes, followed by a fear she would never have imagined seeing on his face. Fear of her seeing. Fear of her knowing. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What was that?" He closed his eyes for a moment, as if in pain. When he opened them, they were more familiar, though still turbulent. "You'd best go back inside," he said, his voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "The wolf was afraid of you," she continued, ignoring his suggestion, her healer's instincts surfacing through the shock. "He wasn't just scared, he was subjugated." Caleb took a step back as if her words were physical. "Emma, stop. The noises at night, your strength, your eyes." She was putting the pieces together, her mind racing through ancient legends, stories her father told of creatures that walked the line between man and beast. "You're not just a bitter soldier, are you?" His expression closed, the mask of fury and isolation falling back into place. But it was too late. She had seen what lay behind it. "Stay out of my way," he spat, repeating the old warning, but now it sounded like a desperate plea. For the first time since she had known him, Emma felt a pang of true fear, not of the wolf in the forest, but of the wolf before her. And yet, mingled with that fear, there was a spark of understanding. She did not move. "You just saved my life. I think it's a little late for me to stay out of your way." He stared at her, an internal war raging in his eyes. He seemed about to say something, but instead he simply shook his head, turned, and vanished into the trees, moving with a silent, inhuman grace that left Emma alone, trembling in the forest clearing, with the dangerous and impossible knowledge weighing in her heart. Chapter 5. The days that followed were woven with a new, heavy, electric silence. Caleb vanished. Not that he was very present before, but now his absence was palpable, intentional. The fortress seemed to hold its breath. Even Brahm noticed, his usually expansive face closed in an expression of silent concern as he kneaded his dough harder than necessary. She didn't see him, but she felt his presence. A pot of herbs she had been looking for appeared neatly arranged on the kitchen counter. The firewood for the fire, which she helped carry, was always already stacked. These were small gestures, anonymous, but she knew. It was him, the wounded alpha, caring for his territory, and for her, in the only way he knew how, from a distance. It was Brioche, of course, who finally broke the stalemate. The little girl dragged Emma to the abandoned orchard behind the fortress, a place of twisted trees and unpicked fruit rotting on the ground. "We need apples," she announced, pointing to the highest branches of an old apple tree where a few stubborn red apples clung on. "Grandpa Brom said it makes a special filling." Emma hesitated. The apples were too high. As she assessed the situation, a familiar shadow moved on the upper balcony overlooking the orchard. Caleb. He was there, motionless, watching. His face was a neutral mask, but his shoulders were rigid.
Brioche, impatient, grabbed the rough trunk and tried to scramble up it, her little feet slipping on the bark.
"No, Brioche!" Emma exclaimed, rushing to the tree. But before she could reach the child, a swift movement on the balcony caught her attention. Caleb had leaned forward, his hands gripping the stone with a force that turned his knuckles white. He said not a word, but every fiber of his being conveyed a silent, potent alarm. It was enough. Emma caught Brioche by the waist and safely lowered her. "It's too high, sweetheart," she said softly, her own heart beating fast. She looked up at the balcony. Caleb visibly relaxed, his body losing its fight-or-flight rigidity. He didn't meet her gaze, but his chin lowered in an almost imperceptible nod of gratitude. Later, in the dead of night, a finely crafted wooden basket appeared on the doorstep of Emma's bedroom. Inside, nestled, were half a dozen of the most perfect apples from the orchard, washed and gleaming. There wasn't a single claw or teeth mark on them. They had been picked by human hands, and wrapped in a soft cloth at the bottom of the basket was a small dagger, its blade short and sharp, the horn handle simple but perfectly balanced, a tool for an herbalist to harvest tough roots, a weapon for a woman to defend herself in the forest. The gift was a contradiction, sweetness and protection, an offer of peace and an acknowledgement of the danger he represented. Emma picked up the dagger, feeling its solid, comfortable weight in her hand. She didn't take it to the forest the next day. Instead, she went to the door of Caleb's study, the one that was always closed. She didn't knock. She knew he would hear her. She placed a small ceramic bowl on the floor, before the door. Inside was a fresh salve she had made with olive oil, beeswax, and a touch of the valerian she had been collecting when the wolf attacked her, to calm the nerves, to promote sleep. She said nothing, just walked away, her footsteps silent on the worn rugs. Minutes later, the study door opened a crack. A large, scarred hand emerged, took the bowl, and disappeared back into the darkness. The door closed without a sound. It was a tacit agreement. A pot of salve for a dagger, one care for another. They didn't exchange words, but they exchanged truths. The barrier between them hadn't fallen, but a door had opened, just a crack, and through it flowed a silent, dangerous understanding. He was a wolf, she a healer, and in this gloomy fortress, perhaps one needed the other more than either of them was willing to admit. The next morning, the kitchen was alive with activity. Brom had declared it Pie Day, with the enthusiasm of a general planning a campaign. Brioche bounced around the workspace, her small hands already dusted with flour. "They're the best apples, Lady Emma," she exclaimed, holding one up to the light streaming through the kitchen window. "See? No spots, no worms, perfect." Emma smiled, carefully peeling the fruit with the small knife from her herb pouch. Not the dagger, that she'd tucked carefully into her belt, its weight both comforting and significant. "They are perfect," she agreed softly. "Someone has a good eye for fruit,"
Brom commented, his tone deliberately casual, as he rolled out pastry dough with practiced efficiency.
But his knowing glance at Emma made her cheeks warm. As Emma sliced the apples, their sweet, tart scent filled the kitchen, mixing with the smell of butter and cinnamon Brom was preparing. Brioche appointed herself the official and cinnamon sprinkler, wielding the spice pot with more enthusiasm than precision. "Not too much, little one," Brom gently redirected her hand. "We want to taste the apples, not just the spice." Emma arranged the slices in careful spirals in the pastry-lined pan, each piece overlapping like petals. It was meditative work, and her mind wandered to the image of Caleb choosing each apple with care. "Now the secret ingredient," Brom announced, producing a small pot of honey. "From the wild hives in the forest, adds a depth that sugar never could." As Emma drizzled the golden honey over the apples, they worked together, covering the pie with a top crust that Brom crimped with his thick fingers, surprisingly delicate in their movements. He cut small vents in the top, and Brioche insisted on making them into the shape of stars.
"For wishes," she explained solemnly. "Grandpa says you should always wish on pies."
As the pie baked, its aroma began to permeate not just the kitchen, but the entire lower floor of the fortress. It was a smell of home, of comfort, of sweetness, in a place that had known too little of it. Emma was washing the bowls when she felt it, that particular awareness that meant she was being observed. She turned, and there, in the shadowed archway leading from the kitchen to the corridor, stood Caleb. He said nothing. His face was carefully neutral, but his eyes were fixed on the oven where the pie baked. When had he last smelled something baking for simple pleasure? When had this kitchen last been full of light and laughter? Brioche spotted him first. "Lord Caleb, we're making pie! You have to try it!" He stiffened, clearly preparing to retreat, but Brom was faster. "The child's right. Can't have you providing the finest apples in the orchard and not tasting the results. It'd be an insult to the fruit." Emma dried her hands, her heart beating faster. She met his gaze across the kitchen. "It won't be ready for another hour," she said quietly. "But we'll save you a piece, if you'd like." The silence stretched. Emma could see the war in his eyes, the instinct to refuse, to maintain distance. "The apples," he said finally, his voice rough. "They were acceptable?" "They were perfect," Emma replied, holding his gaze. "The best I've ever seen." He gave a curt nod, then turned to leave. "Lord Caleb?" Brioche's voice stopped him. "Do you like honey? We put lots of honey in it." He paused, his broad shoulders visible in the archway. Yes, I like honey." "Good! Then you'll really like this pie. Lady Emma made it with love." A sound escaped Caleb. It wasn't a laugh, but something close. A puff of air that could have been a laugh in another life. The corner of his mouth twitched, a near smile that made Emma's heart leap. Chapter 6. Winter arrived at Ashbourne's gates with an icy breath that howled through the cracks in the stones. The first visitor in years crossed the gate, brought not by noble matters, but by the urgent need the forest imposed on all. A woodsman, his face weathered by wind and worry, was greeted by Dominic at the entrance. Emma, returning from the garden with a basket of roots, heard the conversation echoing in the empty hall. "It's not normal, I tell you, sir," the man spoke, his rough voice laden with fear. "It killed 2 of my best hounds. It's bigger than any wolf I've ever seen. And its eyes, they glow like fire in the dark." Emma stopped, her hands clutching the wicker basket. Glowing eyes. She didn't need to look at the shadows at the top of the stairs to know Caleb was there, listening. She could feel his attention, focused and sharp as a blade. Dominic grumbled something about the dangers of the forest and offered the man shelter in the stable for a night. As the woodsman, relieved, walked away, Emma saw Caleb descend the stairs. His movement was fluid, silent, but every muscle seemed tense. He ignored Dominic completely, his eyes fixed on her for a second, a quick but intense gaze loaded with an unspoken warning, before disappearing towards the private quarters. The message was clear: stay indoors. But Emma was not one for blind obedience. That night, as the fortress slept and the wind sang its icy song, she crept down to the kitchen for a soothing tea. The full moon, pale and round as silver coin, illuminated the inner courtyard through the window. It was then that she saw him. Caleb stood in the center of the courtyard, clad only in trousers. His pale skin gleamed under the moonlight. He didn't see her, watching from the darkness of the kitchen. His breath formed white clouds in the freezing air, and he was trembling, not from cold, but from a deep internal tension, as if he were holding something monstrous back by sheer force of will. His fists were clenched, the muscles of his back and arms corded and rigid. He looked up at the moon, his face a mask of agony and concentration, and a low, muffled groan escaped his lips. It was a sound of pure struggle. Emma held her breath. This wasn't the beast showing its power. It was the man fighting to contain it. The revelation was more intimate and more moving than having seen him drive off the wolf. This was his private suffering, the battle he fought every night, alone. The next morning he was gone again. Brom was grim as he served the porridge. He went hunting, was all he said, his gaze heavy and significant resting on Emma. The beast of the forest is no match for common men. Emma spent the entire day with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. Every rustle from the forest made her flinch. She couldn't focus on the herbs, the preserves, not even Brioche's chattering stories. The silence of the fortress was oppressive. At dusk, the main gate opened. Caleb rode in. He was unharmed, not a scratch on him. But his eyes, they held a deep darkness, a fatigue of centuries. His clothes were immaculate, but a faint scent of iron and pine clung to him, a ghost of the violence that had occurred outside. He saw her at the top of the stairs, waiting. He paused, and for a long moment they simply stared at each other across the great empty hall. He didn't need to say a word. The relative peace that hung over Ashbourne that night was proof enough. The threat had been eliminated. He ascended the steps slowly, his energy that of a warrior returning home. As he passed her, he stopped. His arm almost brushed hers. "It's done," he whispered, his voice rough as tree bark. Emma merely nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Later, when she went to her room, she found a new gift on her doorstep. It was not a basket or a weapon. It was a single flower, a delicate Hepatica nobilis, purplish blue that bloomed under the snow in the deepest heart of the forest. It was impossible to pick without a delicate touch. It was fragile, beautiful, and resilient, a symbol of life in the midst of winter, of hope after darkness. Emma picked up the flower, her heart pounding. He hadn't brought her a trophy from his hunt. He had brought her proof that, despite the beast dwelling in his chest, he was still capable of perceiving beauty and of wanting to give it to her. Sitting on the edge of her bed, with the delicate flower in her hands, Emma knew with a certainty that both terrified and warmed her inside that she was hopelessly and irrevocably in trouble. Chapter 7. The autumn harvest at Ashbourne was a modest affair, but for the few remaining servants, it was a sacred tradition. Brom, in his element, transformed the kitchen and adjoining courtyard into a haven of abundance. Rustic wooden tables groaned under the weight of breads, cheeses, and pitchers of strong cider. The air was thick with the smell of food and the sound of hushed laughter, a sound the fortress had long not heard. Brom, with a smile that lit up his broad face, picked up a clumsy guitar and began to play a lively rural tune, his thick fingers surprisingly nimble on the strings. Brioche, in her best dress, which was still stained with dirt, wasted no time. She grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her into the open space in the center of the courtyard, twirling and dancing with unashamed childish glee. Emma laughed, a light, free sound that made Caleb, watching from the shadows of the arcade, feel as if someone had lit a candle in a dark room. He leaned against the cold stone, his instincts conflicting. One part of him, the part that was the alpha, the king, considered this display of joy dangerous frivolity. The other part, the part that was just Caleb, a man, felt a pang of a long-forgotten emotion, longing. It was then that Brioche, in her relentless childish wisdom, ran towards him. "Lord Caleb, you have to dance too. It's the party rule." He froze. "Brioche, I don't," he began, his voice a low growl of embarrassment. But the child was already tugging at his arm with surprising strength, dragging him into the firelight. All movement at the party stopped. The servants stood motionless, their faces a mix of shock and fear. Brom's music faltered. Caleb stood in the center of the courtyard, exposed. His shoulders were tense, his hands clenched into fists. He looked at Emma, expecting to see pity or amusement at his expense. Instead, he saw only an invitation. Her blue eyes gleamed with the firelight, and her smile was soft and encouraging, not mocking. It was that smile that broke his defenses. Hesitantly, ridiculously awkwardly, he placed a hand on Emma's waist and held her other hand in his, as if handling fine porcelain. Their dance was a disaster. He was too big, too stiff, his steps too wide and uncoordinated. He stumbled over his own feet, and in an instinctive move not to crush Emma's feet, he pulled her close, twirling her with a force that was more luck than skill. A murmur of surprise ran through the servants. And then Emma laughed. Not a laugh of scorn, but a laugh of pure, genuine joy. The sound was contagious. And that's when it happened. Caleb's embarrassment, the closeness, the sound of her laughter. The world narrowed to the points where their bodies touched. His hand at her waist could feel the rapid flutter of her heartbeat through the fabric of her dress. Her palm in his was small, delicate, yet there was a strength in her grip that matched his own, not in power, but in certainty. He could feel every curve of her body against his. Her simple scent of soap and lavender invaded his senses, overriding all other smells. Her warmth seemed to burn through his own clothing. Her face was inches from his, her blue eyes wide with surprise, but not fear. And he reacted. Not as a beast, but as a man who had not touched nor been touched in years. An intense heat coursed through his body, concentrating in his face with dizzying speed. His ears, those traitorous ears, burned as if they had been set on fire. He felt the flush rise up his neck, his cheeks, a wave of heat so intense, he felt everyone could see it, even in the flickering light of the flames. Worse, or perhaps better, he couldn't decide. He didn't want to let go. Every instinct screamed at him to pull her closer, to bury his face in her hair, to finally stop fighting the desperate hunger for connection that had gnawed at him for so long. The realization terrified him more than any battlefield ever had. He released her as if she were a flame, backing away 2 steps. He said not a word, just shook his head, a mix of shyness and confusion in his eyes, before turning and disappearing quickly into the darkness, leaving behind a charged silence. Emma stood still, her heart pounding. She had felt it. And in the deep flush of his face, in the pure, unadulterated shame in his eyes, she saw a man. An awkward, vulnerable, and deeply attractive man and his involuntary honesty. Chapter 8. The revelation came days later, on a full moon night. A howl of anguished agony echoed from the forest. Emma, without hesitation, followed the sound to the stables. Inside, in the pale moonlight, she saw him. Caleb, on his knees in the straw, his body writhing in spasms. He was neither fully wolf nor fully man. It was a nightmare of transition, of bones realigning and muscles contorting. His hands were claws, digging into the earth, and when he lifted his head, his eyes were golden and wild. He saw her. "Get out!" he roared, his voice a grotesque mix of human and beast. But Emma did not leave. She stayed, standing in the doorway, a calm presence in the chaos, as he fought his private battle. When the transformation receded, leaving him exhausted and trembling in the hay, she approached. Without a word, she picked up a cloth, moistened it with water, and began to gently wipe the sweat and dirt from his face. He closed his eyes, a tremor running through his body. It was then that the storm began, a roar from the sky, a deluge. The space was cramped, forcing them to stand shoulder to shoulder. Water cascaded down the entrance, creating a silver curtain between them and the outside world. The heat of his body was a furnace against the cold that permeated her. In the darkness, with the storm roaring outside, the truth came to light. "I am a werewolf," he confessed, his voice broken. "The war awakened this in me. That's why I isolated myself." "I'm not scared," she whispered in the darkness. "You should be." His voice was full of anguish. "What's left of me is this, a beast and an empty shell." "You're not empty, Caleb," she said, moving towards him. He let out a sound of frustration. I'm afraid of what I might become." It was then that she touched his face in the darkness. "Then don't be afraid alone." "Enough, that's enough." The words came out harsh. The tone was one of pure desperation. But his actions contradicted his words. He turned, leaning his broad back against the wall, creating a little more space for her away from the splash of the rain. His arm, heavy and warm, brushed hers, and he didn't pull away. The contact was electrifying. She turned to look at him. Drops of water ran down his angular face, dripping from his strong chin. His eyes were closed, their long rain shadows caught against his cheekbones. He looked exhausted, not just from the day, but from life, from the eternal struggle. Without thinking, driven by an instinct that was deeper than fear or reason, Emma raised her hand. Her fingers, cold and trembling, gently touched a scar that snaked from his temple to his jawline. It was an old scar, white and rough against the warmed skin. Caleb flinched violently, as if she had thrust a branding iron into him. His eyes snapped open, and they were wild, disconcerted, inches from hers. His breath hitched. No one touched him like that, not in years. No one dared. He didn't push her away. He didn't growl. He just froze. His intense gaze was locked on hers, searching, questioning, vulnerable in a way that was more intimate than any nakedness. "Does it still hurt?" she whispered, her voice trembling. That simple question seemed to break him. For a fleeting moment, all walls collapsed. She could see not the alpha, not the beast, not the warrior. She saw only a man, a terribly tired and terribly lonely man. His face contorted. He leaned his head forward until his forehead rested against hers. The contact was overwhelmingly impactful. It was a gesture of surrender, of exhaustion, of a deep need he could no longer contain. His warmth enveloped her, and she could feel him trembling, not from cold, but from the internal struggle not to completely fall apart. They stayed like that, still in the world, with the rain singing its relentless song outside, their breath a blur in the small space between them. The air was charged with every unspoken truth, with every barrier finally falling. And then, so softly she might have imagined it, his lips brushed hers. A passionate kiss, a moment of pure, raw, undeniable connection. When they parted, breathless, the storm outside seemed to have lost its fury, now whispering against the stable walls. He drew back just enough to look into her eyes, his hands still firm on her shoulders, as if he feared she was a mirage. He closed his eyes, a final battle fought within him. When he opened them, the last spark of resistance had died out. A few months later, spring had fully arrived, and with it the first harvest festival in the nearest village. For the first time in years, Ashbourne's gates opened not for threats or duties, but for a night of simple joy. Emma wore a simple but new dress, her blonde hair lit by the torches and paper lanterns that adorned the streets. Caleb walked by her side, no longer a hiding shadow, but a present man. His posture was still that of a warrior, but his shoulders no longer carried the weight of the world. His eyes, once dull, now reflected the festival lights as he observed everything with a quiet curiosity. It was strange, he thought. The noise, the crowds, the sweet smells of honey and toasted nuts. All this used to be torture for his keen senses. Now, with Emma's hand holding his, it was just life. They stopped at a stall where an old man molded colored glass over a flame, creating small animals. Brioche, who accompanied them with Brom, was fascinated by a little blue glass horse. "For little Brioche," he said, his voice a little hoarse but calm, as he paid for the object. The child's look of admiration and joy when he handed her the gift was worth more than any king's treasure. Emma pulled him to a clearing where couples danced to the sound of a flute and drum. "Don't ask me to dance," he growled softly near her ear, a familiar blush rising to his neck. She laughed, the most precious sound he had ever heard. "Then just stand here with me." And they did, standing at the edge of the dance, watching the lights, the people, life moving forward. He pulled her closer, his chin resting on her hair, and she fit perfectly against his chest, as if that were the place she was always meant to occupy. Under a sky speckled with stars, with the festival music echoing in the distance, Caleb looked at the woman in his arms. There were no more secrets between them. There was only this, his hand in hers, his heart beating at a quiet, synchronized rhythm. Thank you for watching. If you stayed until the end and liked the story, leave a like. It really encourages me to keep writing more. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. See you soon.